My name is James and I'm a project manager and I'm also the co-founder of Career Insights. In simplified terms, a project manager looks after a construction project or a development from start to finish, from inception through to completion, handover to the client or the end user at the end of the project. I followed the sort of family tradition route. So my granddad owned a construction company and my father owned a construction company, and I sort of followed suit down that pathway into finding construction. Right, testing my memory now. At A levels, I did business, maths, English language, and physical education. Of which, for A level, I think I dropped maths out of those purely for not doing well at my AS levels and having too much work to do for A levels. For university, I studied building surveying, undergraduate. Then I did a part-time master's at Reading University for project management. First sort of part-time jobs, I worked on sites in summer holidays from an early age, probably back when health and safety wasn't as stringent as it is now. My sort of first real jobs in terms of outside of that, when I went to university, first job was working at Gap Kids when I was at Kingston University, and then beyond that, I did paintball marshalling at the weekends. So those were my sort of first steps into the working world. And then my first job outside of university was going to work for my dad's construction company, sort of specialised in construction management, which basically means that rather than being a main contractor and taking on the risk of the subcontractors, you would manage the project, but the client would pay subcontractors direct. And he specialised in the sort of what you would call like the super prime market, so houses sort of £10 million upwards in sort of central London and West End, and that was, I graduated just before the last recession in sort of 08, 09. I think even if I hadn't decided to have gone to work for my dad's company initially, I probably would have ended up there regardless, because a lot of friends that I had that graduated with me never even set foot in the construction industry because of that disaster. So when it came to building surveying, I was actually pretty much at AS level. I wasn't switched on to what I wanted to do. Pretty much going through the obvious suggestions in terms of the accountants, law, and I was really actually starting to run out of time. So from AS level perspective, I hadn't done that well. I think it's the age where you sort of get a car, you become more interested in women. My grades dropped quite a bit. So from an A level perspective, I don't think Belly and my friends saw me because I was working so hard, because I knew I wanted to go to university and I needed to get my grades up from that perspective. I didn't make a decision till late on from a building surveying perspective, and that really came about from conversations with my dad at the time and other colleagues in the construction industry that I just built up over the summer holidays I was talking about. And everyone said that building surveying was probably a safe bet because you learnt more about the industry, and I think as well that you've got sort of parents and grandparents probably a lot of the time not wanting you to get directly involved in the construction industry and probably lean you more to the surveying aspect, which obviously I never set foot in, even though I did it as an undergrad side of things. But from the surveying aspect, you do learn sort of all aspects of building, and also you have a module on quantity surveying, which is actually what I ended up doing my sort of role for my dad's business, which I was more of a commercial manager than anything else. But it'd probably come later in the questions, but when you work for a small company, obviously you get involved in a whole host of things rather than just one area. So that's a big difference. And if you go and work for a big company, if you're going to be a commercial manager or project manager, you're probably going to get really honed down into a particular role, compared to when you're in little companies, you'll end up involved in aspects of the marketing, tons of things that are outside of a typical job scope, down to just doing errands for the company. If I compared that to a big company, for example, just from a project management perspective, you'll get things like pre-con guys, which purely just specify before construction even gets started. So they'll be getting in all the surveys for the project, working with estimators on quotations, with designers, that aspect of it, pre-planning conditions that need to be cleared off. So that in itself is just one role. You'll then have a project manager or a site manager, depending on different companies call them different things, and they'll just look after that component in terms of the build. And on really big projects, you even get project managers actually just looking after different aspects of it. So you might get a project manager just looking after the fabric of the building. So if a concrete frame, for instance, you might have a project manager just looking after the concrete frame for the building, another one doing the fit out aspect of it, or another one just looking after mechanical and electrical aspects of it. So the bigger the project it gets and the bigger the company, the more defined the roles get. So that's one thing you'll notice when you're looking at job descriptions. Very first job I did was working on the at the time the chairman of Yellow Pages house, which was a brilliant opportunity, but I was in way over my head in terms of that. He was a lovely guy once you got to know him, but what was funny at the time is that he was a super serious person whenever he was sort of talking about the project, and his wife was a teacher who was one of the loveliest people in the world. She would always be asking about how was your weekend and talking about to you socially, and immediately in the transition of conversation he would ask you 10 different questions about the project. What was contingency plans, what was this, what was that. So it was like, from a learning curve perspective, I really was chucked in the deep end and having to learn as I went. But in terms of coming back a step in the business in general, as I said earlier, I was more involved in the commercial aspects of it, so I was more like a quantity surveyor. So I would source all the quotations from subcontractors and suppliers. I'd do things like the payroll, payment certificates. So it was a bit of a hybrid role where I would produce all the financial information for the project. So for cash flow, payment certificates, any change orders, essentially feeding that back to the client, helping them make decisions. Because a lot of time, because we were working on obviously their individual houses, they would change their mind all the time. So you're constantly going backwards and forwards with suppliers. Now, the big thing with the high-end industry compared to, say, the starter home industry, is that your number of suppliers and your number of suppliers and your number of subcontractors are through the roof compared to a starter home build. Because everything you work with on high-end stuff has got obviously loads of specialisms. So you're constantly outsourcing. So I can remember doing one project, a big manor house in Hampshire, where I think there was over 105 subcontractors just on one house, but he had an equestrian centre, swimming pool, so a whole host of specialists working on the project, which basically means that when it comes down to things changing or going wrong or delays, it's a whole host of people that you've obviously got caused a knock-on effect for, which if I compared that to, say, a new build and a starter home, so like a 2-bedroom apartment, you're probably looking at somewhere between 30 to 45 subcontractors. It's a much more manageable process in terms of those changes, and obviously they tend to come from developers who are educated clients, so they know in terms of what decisions they need to make by what time frames, etc. When you're working with private clients on high-end stuff, you've obviously got to remember that most of the time they're out of the country. You'll often get, you make a decision for me, but you've got to remember that everything that is in their houses costs tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, and there's no way in a million years that you want to be accountable for making those decisions for them. So you're forever having this backwards and forwards process of needing decisions, otherwise it's going to slow down program on site. So as much as subcontractors, suppliers, the weather can slow you down, the clients in those projects can massively slow you down as well. So there's some differences. But as I said before, I started out really focusing on the commercial elements of the projects and working through those changes with the client and trying to get the information out of them as quickly as I could so that we could deliver that on site. I honestly don't think, I need to be careful for anyone at university, but I honestly don't think anything at university can prepare you for the working world from a construction perspective, because like using some things that you learn at university in terms of like brick joints, and just the basics in terms of foundations. I think yes, they are important. You understand that there's different types of foundations, but until you're in the working world, I don't think any of that really sticks until it's in front of you. And also, the way that construction works is that one project can be completely different from another. So depending on, going back to my example of project managers, a lot of project managers I would more classify as site managers. So they look after one site from start to finish. So they'll go through that cycle. But just using that one project, you'll have, say that project's a steel frame that they're working on, and then the next project is a concrete frame. You kind of become an expert from one project to the next in terms of what you're actually dealing with. So it may be that you work on a project that, say, is steel frame, and it might be 5 years before you work on that project again. So you're forever moving your skills. I'd say that 89% of it is the same, but there is this constant relearning and new challenges that you're calling on. Well, in the beginning, you're calling on no knowledge whatsoever. I think in the beginning, you actually rely more on things like psychology in terms of trusting people, building the right team. You obviously want to make sure that subcontractors get on. So going back to my first role from a commercial aspect, that was one of the key things that I often thought about, is that using the mechanical and electrical, they obviously work quite closely together, as do the carpenters. So I would look at their personalities as well as their prices and think, are these guys going to get on? Because you get quite a lot of finger pointing in construction and the blame game. So those sort of three components, as well as the rest of the team, you want to make sure that they get on, because the last thing you want to be doing is turning into an agony aunt and constantly just listening to people moaning about issues on site, or where they're being held up and where they can't make money. So that's a real key important aspect to it. You're constantly working out, are people the right fit for each other? You can't always get that. Sometimes you have to head each other off, just like you would in everyday life, in terms of that, I'll just be aware of this personality trait that someone's got, and vice versa, just so you can gel them together as best as possible, and hopefully they won't wind each other up. But that kind of comes with the territory of the job. So just give a bit of backstory in terms of, so I graduated, I did a year at work for my dad's business, and coming towards the end of that first year, I decided that I wanted to do a master's. And the reason for doing that is that when you work for a small company, is that you don't have a lot of outside training. So I obviously still had a lot of friends that graduated and went to work for bigger companies, and a lot of those guys get tons and tons of training. Obviously, a lot of the time they'll go on, is it rotations? I don't know what the word is for it, where they'll sort of do 3 to 6 months in different roles. You get tons of training around the team. But when you're working for a company that at the time, I think there was 5 or 6 of us, you just don't get that training. So I looked into a master's at the time. Reading was considered to be the best in the UK of construction. I'm not sure if that still is the case, but it was at the time. And it was just about getting further education. And also it was in project management, which was, even though I was doing more commercial stuff, it was highly more relevant than what building surveying was. So it was more things like law was a big module that we did there. And obviously because I was doing the commercial elements and letting the contracts with subcontractors, that was far more relevant to what I was doing. And because I wasn't getting trained at work, I felt like that was the best thing to do at the time. Before I give a typical day, which obviously isn't really a typical day, it's probably better if I give an overview of my role compared to maybe, I don't want to say a standard or typical project manager, but there are different types. So if you was to go online and search for the role, you will see a whole host of different types coming up. So some project managers I would classify just for ease as site managers, which means that they look after one project, they stay on one project, they do things like site inductions, and they obviously manage all the subcontractors in terms of on-site, and go to the point up to handover, passing off on to potentially a customer care team, or over to a client. So there are elements that I have crossover with that role, but it's slightly different. I'm going to give a different example than actually what I do, but just because it makes more sense, that you get quite a lot of clients that have big construction arms. I use Tesco as an example, or even someone like Ralph Lauren, where their primary function isn't construction, but obviously so much of their business is construction related. So often those guys have actually big construction teams of people, of project managers themselves, but they don't actually build themselves. They hire in main contractors. Now that's essentially what I do, but on a residential front. So I think that sort of gives a synopsis of I'm essentially one step removed from site. So I'll find main contractors. I'll help with getting planning for the site, clearing the planning conditions, doing all the pre-con stuff in terms of surveys, going out for tender for a main contractor, working with a main contractor through to the project, and then I'll work with their in-house marketing teams, customer care teams in terms of handing over projects at the end of it. And obviously I work for a main developer, so it's about handing it over to our customers at the end of the day. There isn't a typical day. What you have in construction is the different phases that you go through. So from planning to pre-com to the project itself to handover to customer care, and then depending on your company's policies, you'll have a defects period, which could be 12 months to 2 years. So essentially I would typically have somewhere between 3 to 5 projects on the go at one time in different phases that they were going through. So I might have one project in the design phase, so I could be sort of sourcing the design teams, getting the structural engineers, architects, potentially planning consultants, depending on whether you can do that in-house or out-house. And I've missed someone glaringly obvious, are the M&E consultants from a design perspective. So one of the first things you would tend to do in my role is you pull those people together, get the price together, appoint them, and you would start working through the design process, essentially working through to close out that portion of design so you could go out to tender to get it going. But I may have another project that's already on site, maybe at the beginning of the project. So I have different types of projects. So I could have a new build that may be like a 10-year program. It's 800 units. We're building phases, we're selling off phases. But I could also have another project which is an office to residential conversion, which has got an incredibly tight program, and that may be at the point where we're just finishing off, or it may be at the point of demolition. So you basically will work through from those phases, from the pre-con design phases of the project to working through the construction phases to handing over, and I'll have different projects at different stages. The thing that I would give as a bit of advice on different types of projects is don't get caught up on big is best, because honestly the smaller projects are often way more complicated. Because if you think about, going back to my example of the phases, you have to go through those phases regardless of the size of the project. So going back to the office to resi conversion, I might have 30 units on an office to residential conversion, but going back to the 800 unit example that I did for sort of 6 or 7 years, that was far easier and less time intensive, because I knew where my next phases were going to be coming. I knew what was going to happen in 2 years. So you would work away and chip away at future workload. Whereas when you get an office to residential conversion, the day that you complete the deal and the building becomes yours, you want to be stripping that out straight away. And so you will need to be working on design and building it all in one go. So those are really, really time intensive compared to something that is much more drawn out over like 5 to 10 years time, just because you can keep chipping away and you know what's coming your way. The bigger sites become more complicated because, as you may or may not have known, depending on getting into the industry, but most developers don't build out those types of size sites themselves. What they do is they'll build a parcel and they'll sell parcels off to help with cash flow. So what that means is that for someone like me, I'm constantly interacting with other companies, like your Bellways or your Western Homes, those types of guys, because they've, say, bought 150 units off of you, but they've got to connect into rows that you've built. So you're constantly liaising with their project management or construction directors over their programs, and obviously you have residents on site already that you've moved phases in, so you've got to keep roads clean. There's different things going on all at different time. So, and I know that might sound like, oh, there's an awful lot going on, and there is, but I think that's part of the sort of skill set that comes with project management, is that you have different projects going on at different levels and different intermediaries all the time, but you've got a handle on who's doing what, and will obviously have tons of people around you to help you in terms of the obviously the design team look after their component. As I said, on the Office of Resi, once you've got a main contractor appointed, they should be taking the majority of the load off of that, and you're now more keeping like a monitoring situation going on with them, making sure that they're interpreting your requirements correctly. And workload in construction obviously comes up and goes down in terms of that. You have like your peak points where the most amount of trades working on site. In the beginning, from completing the design and starting, obviously you'll have quite a lot of civils in the foreground on the first section of the project. So, which basically means you have a ground worker on site for a period at the beginning of the site. So when you've only got one person on site, that's it also a lot easier to manage than obviously when you're in the thick of the build. You've got a lot more subcontractors on site and a lot more activity, and that's when your time tends to be time intensive, so you've got less time to essentially do as much as possible. Cool. You interact with a whole host of different people, so you have a lot of consultants, structural engineer, architect, planning consultants. You might have heritage consultants depending on if it's a listed building or not. Then through to main contractors, subcontractors, ground workers, utility companies. Talking about in-house, you'll have your marketing team, your planning team, customer care team. You may interact with your new business team. So that's like in terms of securing projects. Obviously you've got your chief execs, your CFOs, your finance department, your land department. Sometimes if you've got an internal land team that are looking to secure land, they quite often come over and ask you for your opinion on whether a site's good or bad, and whether you can call on some of your design team to cast their eye over, say, the ground conditions, etc., to help substantiate their bid, essentially. So a whole host of internal and external sources. The most challenging part of the job is probably being the hub of the wheel. So I've definitely gone through phases where you get a lot of headaches. You lose your voice quite a lot in terms of talking, whether that's on the phone or on site. Being that hub is definitely the hardest component of it. And I think most project managers also struggle to shut off when they first go on holiday. So the first sort of 2 to 4 days, a lot of us struggle to shut down because of you constantly being that resource. And also your company just letting you go. Because everything funnels through you, it's really difficult to just switch it off. And even if you leave a company, you'll find that they'll still contact you 6-12 months after the event, asking you for information or asking you about conversations that took place, whether that was agreed or not agreed. So that's definitely probably one of the most difficult aspects to the job. I think the fact that you're dealing with so many different types of characters is obviously can take a huge toll on you. So you know how varied people can be. So you can have a very jovial conversation for 10 minutes, and you can have quite a heated conversation 10 minutes after that. So you've got to keep quite an even keel all the time, and also look after yourself in terms of that. There are definitely days where like Friday afternoon where you'll definitely notice that your phone starts to die down. That's probably because a lot of people, they don't want you to ask them to come in on a Saturday, but vice versa, you're probably just at that point where you're tapering down. I'd say another difficult thing with construction is that you're very unlikely to get a project on your doorstep. So obviously a lot of people like to work, say, within a 10-20 minute commute. Now with construction, you might get one of them in your lifetime or 1 in 10 years. And depending on which, you obviously get different people in construction. Some people in construction will just want to stay local, so they'll jump from one company to the next, from project to project, try and stay within the locality of it. But for most of us, you'll stay for a company for a number of years, and that will mean in terms of that sometimes that you've got a project that's half an hour away from you, and sometimes it can be 2-3 hours away from you. So I think that's another difficult thing, is that it's constantly changing in terms of your commute. obviously what time you're getting home, what time you can get to the gym, that type of component. My favourite part of the job is quite easy. I love learning about other businesses and how they work. So when you're obviously a project manager and you're in the middle of everything, so you're constantly meeting new specialists, new designers, and I love learning about how their industry works. Using materials, for example, in the UK, like we don't manufacture much at all. So we have a huge merchant industry in the UK, which means that the merchants will be buying materials from other countries and funding it through them and distributing out to you, which means that obviously there's this margin on top of it. But it works for manufacturers because they essentially don't want to take the risk with a lot of big contractors and developers. And they want to spread their risk out to like smaller companies essentially to protect themselves. And I get fascinated by that aspect of it, of how do things actually work, and because obviously a lot of things within our industry is driven about value, and that's something that I'm quite passionate about. Is that one of the roles I did in like a few years ago now was about specification for our buildings. So I'm hugely passionate about the value is perceived. So what that means is that you might look at a front door, for example, and I can show you two front doors and ask you to grade them out of 10, and you may say, oh, that one's 7 out of 10 and the other one's 7.5 out of 10. But I may say to you, yeah, but one is £200 and the other one is £1,000. And yeah, you said the £1,000 is worth half a point more, but that isn't worth the price difference that I've just explained. So, and that's something that I'm quite passionate about, is that making sure that the product looks premium, but it's actually an affordable price, so that everybody's happy in terms of that the developer has been able to make their margin on the scheme, but also the customer is super happy with the product at the end of it. And I think that's a skill that is definitely something that you want to get into the industry. I think you could definitely use that as an advantage in terms of trying to learn products and learn how much things cost, because I think that's an area in the industry that gets lost between who's responsible for it, in terms of like, is the architect responsible for it? Is the project manager on site responsible for it? Which is often it's too late. Has the client actually got someone looking into that, or have they brought in a buying team to do it? But quite often buyers don't look at that added value component in terms of, does it visually look right? They're just looking at it from a point of view of, oh, I can buy that door and buy 10,000 of those doors at this price, but they're not actually looking at the physical aesthetics of the product and whether actually the customer is going to pay for that. And that's the whole guessing game. So yeah, I'm very passionate about that, because I think that that's a real way to differentiate yourself in the industry and be able to get a premium product for the right price. Whereas a lot of people, I think, struggle with that, and I'm sure a lot of you have walked around developments and thought that's hideous, and that's one thing that really annoys me, because obviously I can look at stuff and think that is disgusting, but I can also look at it and think they've paid so much money for that to look disgusting. Whereas you may look at it and think, oh, that's nice, not nice, and not know the price difference between the two of it. So that's a love, but also a pet peeve when people get it wrong.